Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go straight ahead. Our focus on the next session is on the great transition in energy, with a firm focus on the future, what lies ahead. We'll look at both the issues that obviously have just grown sharper with what's happening in the Middle East, but also great opportunities, the situation in Europe, and how the geopolitical turmoil might affect things. So to kick us off on that, it's my great pleasure to welcome Francis Fannon, former US Assistant Secretary of Energy, who's going to open this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a real joy to be with you all here in Athens. Over the last 2 years, the world began an historic reorientation of our energy systems. The COVID pandemic strained to the breaking point our traditional supply chains. Russia's unwarranted and illegal invasion of Ukraine broke energy-related supply chains in this region and sent reverberations around the world. And a continually more aggressive, autocratic and militaristic China ensures that many existing energy supply chains, particularly concerning clean energy, will face terminal decline. We face a great pivot point in our geopolitical energy architecture. 2 weeks ago in southern Israel, people gathered to celebrate peace on the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. The evil Hamas terrorists chose this anniversary to wage what has been referred to as a pogrom, and I've heard the ambassador speak powerfully to this issue. This is so much larger than an energy issue, of course, but it is worth noting that, unlike in 1973, oil is not being used as a weapon, but oil prices could become volatile as a result of conflict. In 1973, America was the world's largest oil importer. Today, the U.S. is the world's biggest oil and gas producer and a net oil exporter. Yet America remains part of a broader energy market and subject to geopolitical events. As dominant as the energy endowment may be in the United States, it cannot go it alone. Energy statecraft requires a shared vision and execution with like-minded partners. Such a shared vision is not obvious or predictable or should be assumed. For years, the United States warned Germany against over-reliance on Russian energy. Yet, that gas fueled much of Germany's industrial capacity and jobs, which made quitting a hard thing to do politically. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, its second in less than a decade, we should remember, Berlin finally ended the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Russia's actions forced changes to Europe's natural gas market. Western Europe increased domestic production, including from the Eastern Mediterranean region, redirected American LNG cargoes, and prayed for a warm winter. After averting last year's crisis and with high gas storage levels, Brussels is wrestling with its midterm path. The development of the Eastern Mediterranean gas region is a bright spot in European energy. Offshore gas discoveries were at first considered too large and too expensive for any one country to economically develop. But by connecting supply to demand centers and building the south-north pipeline delivery systems like the IGB, Greece now serves as an energy gateway to the rest of Europe. Energy markets and future pricing correlate to government policy and sentiment. As such, Brussels should strongly support Greece in the development of the Eastern Med. To do otherwise strains credibility. War has reoriented the global oil markets as well and helped to catalyze a new energy access of Russia, Iran, and China. Although Europe and the US sanction Russian oil imports, and America officially prohibits import of Iranian barrels, these pariah nations face little trouble in selling to China. Beijing is exploiting war and crises to further its broader aims, including, but not limited to, securing discounted energy. Increasingly, China appears to be turning Russia into a client state. Beijing has long braced against using the global standard US dollar for commodities and energy transactions. Moscow has recently called for all of their oil trade to be settled not in Russian rubles, but in Chinese yuan. Some politicians have argued that we could improve energy security by accelerating the clean energy transition away from hydrocarbons. This is simplistic thinking that today could make free nations less secure and increase dependency on our greatest strategic threat, China. China controls 70 to 90% of the key minerals, processing, or manufacture of clean energy systems today. The Chinese Communist Party successfully executed a years-long global and domestic industrial strategy and now effectively maintains the commanding heights of the clean energy economy. This is not to suggest that the West needs to lose, but it does require a degree of sober pragmatism that too often is overwhelmed by the cries for greater ambition. We are in the beginning stages of the clean energy transition. Governments should heed the lessons of Russian energy dependency and not increase dependency on Beijing. We should develop clean energy supply chain relationships based on trust, shared values, and a level playing field, all criteria that Beijing lacks and rejects with prejudice. Europe and America are committed to the clean energy transition to mitigate the effects of climate change. China developed its clean energy capacity to reduce its strategic vulnerability to oil imports and assert control over global supply chains that underpin the West's decarbonization goals. Whereas Washington and Brussels work to accelerate net zero plans, Beijing approves the equivalent of 2 new coal plants per week. Last year, China permitted 106 gigawatts of new coal power generation. That's more than the collective generating capacity of Germany, Poland, Czechia, Italy, the UK, Bulgaria, Romania, and Serbia. Unless Western governments take bold actions, an accelerated energy transition could embolden China to utilize an entirely new quiver of energy weapons. In 2010, Beijing banned rare earth exports over a fishing dispute with Japan. Yet in 2023 alone, China prohibited exports of gallium, germanium, graphite, and Beijing's manipulation of cobalt market pricing forced America's only cobalt development mine to suspend operations. The good news is it's not too late. The United States, European nations, and other allies can build a responsible, secure, and reliable clean energy supply chain. Some may wonder, as we heard earlier, if America is up to the task, given the apparent dysfunction in our politics. This is an appropriate question. After all, not having a Speaker of the House is abnormal. Yet both Republicans and Democrats agree that America must develop a clean energy supply chain less reliant on Beijing. The challenge before us is not a messy Washington, but an unrealistic view of the true costs of time and funding and the scale of the energy transition. This will take longer and cost more than politicians care to admit. For the energy transition to succeed, our leaders and public must come to terms with the challenges ahead. Yet in the immediate term, it's unclear how the new energy access of Russia, Iran, and China might try to take advantage of war. Even less clear is how the US and Europe might be willing to respond. Democracies, especially the United States, have many energy policy tools to act, but politicians find themselves politically constrained by prices. In his famous moon speech, President Kennedy asked, quote, "The Congress and the country to accept a firm commitment to a new course of action, a course which will last for many years and carry very heavy costs," unquote. Transforming the world's economic engine presents an orders of magnitude far greater than putting a man on the moon. It is time that we get to work. Thank you.
Well, Frank, can I, before we move on, can I pick you up on a couple of those things? It's fascinating to me that obviously our discussion this morning has been largely focused on Israel and the Middle East, but you really focused on China. which is, of course, in the longer term scheme of things, the great strategic challenge to the United States. And I think, again, we focused on division of Congress, but that is, as you alluded to, one area where there is a surprising degree of agreement, I would say. It stands out as the one area of surprising agreement on both sides of the political divide. So how do you think, given that agreement, how well do you think the United States is actually placed in this strategic competition with China right now? You seem to have suggested that China, as it were, stole a march through inattention, but actually there's a lot of attention right now on China. So how is the United States and the West generally doing in this strategic domain? Yeah,
thank you. I do think that this is the future because, as was stated earlier, the clean energy transition is happening. This is not a question, it's a fact. The question, however, that remains is who will have that ability to influence energy systems and of course, pricing in the future. The real singular challenge with China is if they're in control, then we're beholden to them to achieve our objective, which is to mitigate the effects of climate change. This is not China's objective. So so it's imperative that we get this right in the West because we do have a set of shared values and shared mission set between the United States and Europe. How are we doing? I would say that when I was at the State Department, I created initiatives around raising the awareness of critical minerals and its importance to the clean energy transition. In 2019, 2018, the question I would get was, why are you talking about this? Now no one's talking, that is no longer a question. Now we're focused on the remedy. What do we do about it? And so in that regard, I think we've moved a long way. I think that the US record is mixed. We face a dual challenge of wanting of speed for climate action versus security. And this tension is bearing out in terms of the guidance and the rulemaking that has yet to occur in the context of the Inflation Reduction Act, for example. But I think we have a North Star and we're moving forward. It's just we're going to have to rethink that it's going to take longer.
And what do you do on this issue of strategic metals?
Yes.
What do you do? I mean, is it alternative supplies? Is it alternative technology? Or presumably a bit of everything, but yeah. Where should efforts be focused?
Yeah, it's all of those things. You're exactly right. And the challenge is also that the time horizons that we have to work within that policymakers state do not align with the development timeline of a mine. According to the International Energy Agency, it takes 15 years from initial discovery to take a mine into production. When you have to increase the volumes of these metals, we haven't even discovered the resource yet, started developing them. So the time horizon, we have to be realistic about this. In the oil business, they would always say that the great cure for high oil prices is high oil prices. It stimulates investment. But we're not seeing that investment in terms of the mining itself. Why? Because China controls such a dominant position in terms of the resources. Because what we're doing, the energy transition is opening up a new realm of what energy looks like. And it's metals intensive, and US Western companies have not been in that business. China has been. So the record is an incomplete, I would say.
Should there be, I mean, we heard in the earlier session with Professor Stiglitz, setting prices which stimulate demand. Is there something of that in the energy, in the strategic metals space as well?
Yeah, there's ongoing, there's existing Department of Defense maintains stockpiles. So there is that state level procurement, but I would caution that as a response. I mean, the U.S. Department of Defense is also the world's largest purchaser of oil, but it's immaterial relative to the size of the vehicle fleet and the consumer demand. What we do not have state economies as much as one wants to talk about industrial policy in the West. We have government stimulates, can create signposts, can create boundaries for market activity. That's our competitive advantage. What we need to do is find ways to stimulate the private sector. That's the objective, and I don't think price controls, it hasn't worked in any other industry. in the energy space, and I would not think it would work here.
Well, let's turn to you, Aristofanis Stefatos, Chairman, CEO of HEREMA, Hellenic Hydrocarbons and Energy Resources Management Company. Your perspective on this issue?
Yes, well, I'm pleased to be here, and what can I say other than try to pass a more positive message, because I think all the previous speakers have actually touched on very important elements that we need to take into consideration. My role, and from my perspective and our company perspective, is to provide solutions. So, very well put, we have the great transition, as the Economist describes it. To my knowledge, it's the first time that the humanity has conceptualized and is attempting such a great transition in magnitude and scale. It's unprecedented. So we should be comfortable that as we walk through uncharted waters, we will do mistakes. So we need to be flexible, and we need to have an agile plan on how to deliver this. And the cost of the transition is definitely something that we need to constantly have in mind. I like to remind people that it was before the Russian invasion in Ukraine that the European gas market prices skyrocketed on unimaginable levels. And that was the first, I would call it, cost crisis in the energy. Then we had the war, and the war created a disruption for the 40% of the gas supply of Europe. And that brought us before the realization that we also have an issue about the security of our supply. So this thing makes things more complicated. And I think the governments have been faced with these stark realities. They are revisiting and reviewing their strategies. From that respect, I would like to say that in Greece, under the leadership of our Prime Minister Mitsotakis, we have made some very decisive steps, and our company is leading several of them. So I would like to point out that it was already by 2021 that we restarted the exploration efforts for domestic gas in Greece. And we should always have in mind that the estimations, we don't know for sure until we drill, is that we are talking about tentative reserves that way above the domestic demand. So it's a European and a regional issue. It's quite important, I would say, in that respect. Then it was only April last year that our Prime Minister Mitsotakis announced that these projects, these exploration projects, are of strategic and national importance. And since then, what we managed to do, we kick-started and actually completed 7 exploration projects with the help of our investors, Greek companies and international players. Among them, I would like to mention ExxonMobil, the biggest energy corporation of the world. But let me not confuse you. This is not an attempt to slow down the energy transition. This is not turning back and staying with a hydrocarbon-dominated economy. We are actually taking very specific and direct action towards the energy transition. It was last year that our company, which carried the legacy of the oil and gas exploration management, was expanded in scope. So we are now responsible, and we are working on the national program for the offshore wind development in Greece. And we have also taken the responsibility for the carbon management through the underground permanent storage, the geological storage of CO2. So on the CCS front, shortly after we took that responsibility, we issued the first exploration license last year. And there is an attempt to turn the depleted oil fields in the Prinos area into permanent storage sites for CO2. And I should point out that this is only the second project, European project in the region. So we are moving fast in that front. And now on the offshore wind, which is something quite important, we will announce next week on Tuesday, together with Minister Skylakakis and Deputy Minister Zdoukou, our national program, so I cannot spoil the formal announcement, but I would like to highlight the fact that Greece, besides the sunshine throughout the year, is also blessed by a very strong wind potential. And this wind potential, again, exceeds the national demand for clean energy. So we are quite optimistic in a way and very happy that once again, we think that we can offer opportunities that promote bilateral and multilateral collaboration in the area, and opportunities that span across the energy mix spectrum. So with that being said, I am quite happy, and I would like to throw some set of hope that the actions of Greece are quite decisive in terms of the energy transition. They're, I would say, them as pragmatic as you can have them. Let's not forget that the CCS is an essential requirement for the hard-to-abate industries. We do not want to lose industries. So we are coming with a range of opportunities which put, in my opinion, Greece in the forefront of this transition and an example for our European partners. So we're really, you'll see me smiling when I
Well, thank you for this dose of optimism this morning. It's been in short supply until now, so thank you for that. I suppose my question is to do with, with all the potential that you outline. Greece is an energy exporter of gas, of wind, and wind energy, and so on. It's a bit of a perennial question for Greece, which is what's been stopping you up till now? What are the obstacles that prevent this from this potential from being realized in Greece? Because presumably this gas has always been there waiting to come out. Yes. The wind has always been blowing. For some time, wind power has been a priority in many parts of the world. Is there something in this country that protects the potential from being properly realized?
Thank you very much for the question, because it's a question I receive often. And I think we need to grow above that speculation, because if we look at the facts, essentially we're exploring in ultra-deep waters, way far away from the shore. So we didn't have the technology to do that until the last decade, I would say. And that is more or less the time that Greece made its first steps in that direction. Unfortunately, we were held back by the financial crisis. So we are exploring in previously unexplored areas, and the optimism comes from the findings in the East Med. So from analog geological basins like the Cyprus or the Egyptian areas, we see that there is a lot of hope. So we follow the market, and this is what our investors as well are telling us. So it is a matter of maturity in that respect. When it comes to the offshore wind, essentially now we're talking about moving again in the offshore sector, and because of the geographical setup and the water depths in Greece, we will be looking at most likely floating projects. So the technology has only matured recently. So one could very easily say, what stopped you from going there? But it's the simple reality is we didn't have the technology yet. Now that the technology is maturing, now it's the time to move in that front as well. And that's what we're doing.
So if I could come back to you, you have this picture. You painted a very global picture of what needs to be done. We've just heard a sort of more micro case study of Greece. And I guess that sort of thinking is probably reproduced in many other cases. How do you marry those two perspectives? The sense that there is a huge macro challenge, but also in place after place, one suspects a lot of micro activity. If you were in your old job of making strategic sense of this all, what would you be doing?
Well, I would look at, yes, Greece is the model, but Greece is only one part of this regional puzzle. And I would look at the development of the Eastern Mediterranean as a solution set that we could project elsewhere, which is the development of regional energy markets based on the relative supply and demand of each part. So the gas, for example, that was first discovered off the coast of Israel was far too expensive and too big to develop economically to meet just this relatively modest Israeli market. So they created connectivity amongst the region and created effectively a super region here where And I think is also, we often talk about energy in the context of conflict. But here we see where energy and energy trading relationships is a binding agent that allows for other opportunities for partnership. And you heard from earlier that the former Prime Minister from North Macedonia spoke to that as an example. So by creating these linkages, I think that we could replicate this based on the relative endowments of each country and each region. Not all countries are going to have the gas endowment that we have here, but there could be other opportunities, hydropower, and how we can connect that to a region. Because once we have this energy flows, it creates, energy is far more than BTUs or barrels. It really is the foundation for economic development, for jobs, for tax revenue. So we should look at energy as that foundational base and see how it could create knock-on effects that are quite positive.
So if I could ask you, turn to you both on this question, which I think leads on to this, which is if capital is not so big a problem as it was, certainly during the financial crisis, technology is now becoming even more of an enabler. Perhaps the big obstacle these days is geopolitics, not just what we see in the Middle East, but to realize the potential of a region, you have to have a significantly improved relationship between Greece and Turkey in particular. What potential do you see that for the energy in the energy sphere?
Well, I would dare to turn it around and say actually the geopolitics is helping us understand better the importance of Greece and what Greece can contribute for the solution. Because it is the disruption of the traditional supply chain that brings forward the need for domestic European energy production. And this is where we come to offer a tentative solution. So I think the fact that we are within the European territory is, at the same time, is a very convenient situation for us. And I think that we should we should not get carried away by the tensions around the world, but rather turn it around and invite people for bilateral and multilateral collaboration, because most of these projects will benefit. The economics of the projects will improve through, for example, if we're talking about renewables, we will need to have the interconnections. We will need to grow our grids in order to stabilize them. If we're talking about the traditional, the fossil fuels, which we are focusing on the gas, we will probably need to build and continue providing the markets. And Greece is located, it's in the doorstep of Europe. So we already have made significant progress with the LNG. We have the doubling the capacity of the LNG in Revithoussa. We're building the FSRU in Alexandroupolis, and we are growing that. I think we should stay focused on that, and we should be inviting to everyone who can deliver the needed supplies to stabilize the European energy mix.
Right.
Yeah, I completely agree with the sentiment. It was my remarks. I noted that the market looks at government in terms of direction, in terms of as they can start. What is future pricing? What does that look like? Where do we invest capital? And to the extent to which government, whether that's in Brussels or Washington or elsewhere, says that this particular form of energy will sunset, has no terminal value. It's over in some arbitrary year. It's going to constrain capital, and you're not going to see. It's going to end up creating a higher price environment, but then you're not going to see the capital flow, even though it normally would otherwise. And so I would just also think about this conversation that we're having isn't just a Northern Hemisphere question, and we seem to forget the rest of the world and what they're running themselves on and what their probability to run on in the future. We have to speak to the needs of the developing world as well. I mean, immigration is a big issue, as well as climate change, and there's a relationship there. But it's really the lack of opportunity, and there's a lot of controversy, both in the U.S. and in Europe, in terms of migration flows. How do we arrest that? It's to create opportunity. And I'm struck by I was having a conversation with a minister from Africa who was very upset about the restraint of investment in the gas projects in Africa. And his comment to me was that you Westerners, and your focus on ESG, that means my people get to breathe clean air in the dark. And I just thought that was such a striking visage, of how this, we all look at this quite differently. And the United States and Europe right now, we're arguing about creating carbon-related barriers around steel, hard-to-abate sectors. The US produces 4% of the global steel, and Germany, which is by far the largest producer in Europe, produces 2%. China produces 55% of the global steel volumes. We seem to be arguing with ourselves, well-intentioned as it is, but we're not focused on the issue, the wedge. And I think, how do we bring that, how do we have that conversation to focus on the highest emitter? How do we focus the conversation to allow for empowerment of the developing world and bring them in the conversation? Because if this is a shared exercise, we all have to have a part in it. And I think we have a challenge there.
Can I just, to close, ask you about the United States? And we had a lot of talk just now about different administrations and what might be at risk. But what about the energy perspective on this? Is there really going to be that much potentially difference between another administration if we go back to a Trump administration? You're very familiar with this. Is there continuity, or perhaps more continuity than we sometimes frame it in the outside world to US energy policy? And if that is the case, is there perhaps more dependability on consistency of policy between electoral cycles?
Yeah, I think as much as we talk about this, the reality is most energy in the United States is not, there's a very modest, if any, federal nexus, meaning that the restraint that the federal government can have is pretty tenuous. Most of the U.S. is the biggest oil and gas producer in the world, not because of federal policy of any particular administration, but because the resources are on private lands, and in particular in states like Texas, and the landowner had skin in the game to produce the resource. So that's the key here. It's not federal government. Now, where the federal government can, the signal, it does matter, is where in things like federal waters. And the Biden administration has restricted the development of offshore oil and gas relative to what a Republican administration has done, including the Trump administration. But is that meaningful? Not today, not in a decade, maybe after that, but who knows what the world will look like then. The other area that government policy was talked about was in context of things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which is, there's a debate on the volume of subsidy that will be applied, but it is important. And I don't think that would have a significant modification. The House Ways and Means Committee, run by Republicans, the tax writing committee in the United States, had a reform bill, which they trimmed a lot of things that were included in the Inflation Reduction Act. But importantly, they did not zero out the subsidies. A part of that is because some of these subsidies were also taking place, being executed in red states and Republican districts. But again, back to, it's about the private enterprise. Elon Musk did not choose to move Tesla from California to Texas. That was not because of the Inflation Reduction Act. He did that far before the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, capital flows to where it's wanted. But this has an absolutely critical point as we talk about execution of the energy transition, is the permitting system. And that is an area where the US government could have an outsized role to realize this energy electrification of everything concept requires a complete rethink of the grid and things like wind, offshore. How are we going to build transmission lines to go from the load centers to the demand centers? It is a manifestly difficult challenge, and it's politically politically challenging, but at the state, local, and certainly the government level.
So we talked about obstacles in Greece. Certainly in the United States context, permitting is a central topic. So I'm sure in future events like this, we might return to that. But for now, thank you both very much for a fascinating session. Thank you.